My name is Harper Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've been described with words that sound flattering but feel limiting steady, dependable, low maintenance. I work in revenue strategy, or at least I did. If you met me in the hallway back then, you probably wouldn't have remembered much. I don't command rooms with volume. I don't interrupt. I don't decorate my confidence with noise. I take notes. I ask precise questions. I listen longer than most people are comfortable with. And in certain corporate environments, that kind of presence becomes invisible. The story I'm about to tell you begins on a Tuesday morning when I was called into a glass conference room and told I was being let go for poor performance. It ends less than 45 minutes later, in a parking lot, with my phone ringing before I had even started my car. But this isn't a revenge story. There was no yelling, no dramatic speech, no folder slammed onto a table. There wasn't even anger, not in the way you'd expect. What happened was quieter than that. This is a story about perception, about how easily consistent excellence can be mistaken for background noise. It's about what happens when someone who has carried more than her share decides, very calmly, to stop carrying it, and it's about documentation, numbers, receipts, the quiet power of knowing exactly what you've done even when no one else bothered to look. I won't pretend I was perfect. I made compromises. I stayed silent when I should have clarified. I allowed assumptions to grow around me because correcting them felt exhausting. That part is mine to own, but I also understood something they didn't. When I submitted my final revenue breakdown, the one with my name attached to 73% of the company's closed sales for that fiscal year, I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I was trying to tell the truth in the only language the board respected: data. And data, when presented without emotion, has a way of rearranging power. The CEO called me back before I even left the parking lot. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was revealing. Over the next hour and the months that came after, I learned that being underestimated is not always a weakness. Sometimes it's insulation. Sometimes it's leverage. This is the full story, not the headline version, not the viral clip, but the human version, the quiet parts, the uncomfortable parts, the decisions that didn't look brave at the time, but changed everything later. Have you ever been invisible in a room where you were doing most of the work? To them, I was reliable. That was the word that appeared most often in my performance reviews. Reliable, consistent, supportive, a strong operational backbone. Never strategic, never visionary, never revenue driving. It's interesting how language can shrink a person without sounding cruel. When I joined the company 5 years ago, we were barely clearing 7 figures in annual sales. I was hired to clean up back-end processes. That's what the job description said. What it actually meant was that sales were chaotic, attribution was messy, and leadership couldn't clearly explain why some quarters worked and others didn't. I didn't complain. I built systems. I redesigned the CRM tagging structure. I implemented pipeline forecasting models. I stayed late mapping client acquisition paths so we could finally see which partnerships were actually converting. Quiet work, spreadsheet work, the kind that doesn't photograph well for LinkedIn. The sales directors loved presenting quarterly wins. They'd stand in front of the board and say things like, "Our new outbound push is really gaining traction." What they didn't mention was that I had restructured territory allocation 3 months earlier, eliminating internal competition that had been cannibalizing deals. But that's how it works sometimes. The visible person gets the narrative. The invisible one stabilizes the ground. I didn't mind at first. I told myself impact mattered more than credit. And to be fair, I was compensated well. My bonuses were consistent. My name was included in group congratulations emails. Leadership would occasionally say, "We couldn't do this without Harper." That sentence always sounded generous. It was also vague. Over time, a pattern formed. When numbers were strong, the sales team celebrated execution. When numbers dipped, operations was asked to tighten things up. I became the steady background hum, the system fixer, the process refiner, the person who would stay late reconciling discrepancies before anyone else even noticed them. I rarely spoke in large meetings, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that when I did speak, my comments were often rephrased by someone louder 5 minutes later and suddenly received with enthusiasm. The first time that happened, I assumed it was accidental. By the 10th time, I understood it wasn't. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed competence compounds. I stayed because I thought eventually the data would be so undeniable that perception would adjust on its own. I stayed because I didn't want to be seen as difficult. That word followed women like a shadow in corporate spaces. Assertive became aggressive. Clear became cold. Directness became intimidating. Reliable was safe, so I let them see me that way. Behind the scenes, though, something else was true. Which partnerships generate the highest lifetime value? I had identified them. The pricing adjustments that increased close rates by 18%, my analysis. The upsell strategy that quietly doubled retention revenue built from my modeling, but none of that had a spotlight. To them, I was the woman with the spreadsheets, the one who didn't cause friction, the one who would fix it. I don't think anyone intentionally minimized me. It's more subtle than that. If you never advocate for visibility, people assume you don't need it. And I had become very, very good at not needing anything. At least, that's what they thought. The first small cut didn't look like a cut at all. It happened during a quarterly leadership sync about 18 months before I was fired. We were reviewing pipeline acceleration strategies, and I had spent the previous 2 weeks analyzing conversion bottlenecks between demo and close. I noticed a pattern: enterprise clients weren't stalling because of pricing. They were stalling because of procurement timing misalignment. In simple terms, we were pitching at the wrong fiscal moments. I built a presentation, 12 slides, clean charts, no fluff. When my turn came, I walked through the data in the room calmly. I suggested shifting our outreach cycles to align with enterprise budgeting windows. If we timed proposals correctly, I projected a 22% lift in close rates without increasing headcount. There were nods, a few thoughtful expressions. The CEO said, "Interesting." We moved on. About 20 minutes later, one of the senior sales directors, Mark, circled back. "You know," he said casually, leaning back in his chair, "I've been thinking we should time enterprise outreach around fiscal planning windows. Might help close rates." The room lit up. "That's smart." "Yeah, that makes sense. We should test that immediately." I sat there, pen resting between my fingers. It wasn't dramatic. No one looked at me to see if I'd already said it. No one seemed aware that they were responding to the same idea, just delivered in a different voice. Mark glanced at me briefly, not apologetically, not challengingly, just neutrally, as if the origin of the idea wasn't relevant. I could have spoken up. I could have said, "That's exactly what I just presented." But something inside me hesitated. I ran the calculation quickly. Would correcting him improve the outcome, or would it shift the energy in the room? Would I be seen as collaborative or territorial? So I stayed quiet. After the meeting, a colleague from finance stopped me in the hallway. "That enterprise timing idea was sharp," she said. Glad Mark amplified it. Amplified. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. I went back to my desk and opened the CRM dashboard. I tagged the new outreach cadence as Enterprise Fiscal Alignment Q3 Initiative. I documented the date, attached my original analysis file, sent a follow-up email summarizing the strategy, and copied leadership. Not to claim credit, just to create clarity. That was the first small shift in me. Not anger, not resentment, awareness. Over the next quarter, close rates increased by 19%, slightly under my projection, but close enough that everyone celebrated the new enterprise strategy. Mark received recognition during the all-hands meeting. He thanked the team broadly. Operations were mentioned as support. Reliable support. That was the first time I felt something fracture quietly inside me. Not because I needed applause, but because I saw the pattern forming. Ideas sounded different depending on who delivered them. Visibility followed confidence, not contribution. I went home that night and opened my leather portfolio. I printed the updated revenue breakdown and added it to a new section I labeled Attribution. Not as a weapon, as a record. If this was going to be the environment, I decided I would never again rely on memory alone. It was a small cut, barely visible, but small cuts, repeated often enough, teach you exactly where you stand. And I was beginning to understand mine. After that first meeting, nothing changed, which is exactly how patterns become permanent. The enterprise timing strategy rolled out successfully. Revenue climbed. The board was pleased. Mark's confidence grew. and I continued refining the back-end models that ensured the projections held steady. If you had asked me then whether I felt disrespected, I probably would have said no, because disrespect rarely announces itself clearly. It arrives disguised as oversight, as busyness, as a hierarchy. A few weeks later, I noticed something else. In cross-functional meetings, when I asked clarifying questions about pipeline assumptions, they were often met with polite impatience. "We'll iron that out later. That's operational detail. Let's stay high level." But when a male colleague raised nearly identical concerns 10 minutes later, the tone shifted. "Good catch. That's important. Let's unpack that." It wasn't blatant enough to confront. It wasn't harsh enough to escalate. It was just consistent. And consistency is what makes something real. At first, I rationalized it. Maybe my tone was too measured. Maybe I framed things too cautiously. Maybe I wasn't positioning my insights with enough authority. So I adjusted slightly. I shortened my statements, removed qualifying language, presented conclusions instead of questions. The response didn't change much. Then came the reassignments. One of my long-term partnership accounts, a mid-market client I had personally onboarded and nurtured into a multi-year expansion, was moved under a newly hired sales manager. The explanation was alignment restructuring. I wasn't consulted. When I asked about the transition, I was told, "You're so good at building systems. Harper, we need you focused there. Let sales own the relationships." That phrasing sounded complimentary. It also erased the fact that I had been closing those relationships quietly for years. I went back to the CRM and looked at the numbers. My name appeared as primary architect or deal strategist on a majority of high-value contracts. Not always front-facing, not always presenting, but embedded in the win notes, in the margin calculations, in the negotiation revisions. I began tracking it more intentionally. Every pricing adjustment I modeled, every retention strategy I proposed, every account save that resulted from a restructuring I suggested. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just thoroughly. And yet, outwardly, I remained the same. Calm, efficient, undemanding. Because somewhere along the way, I had internalized the idea that competence should be self-evident. If I just kept delivering, recognition would follow naturally. But that belief depends on a fair system, and systems are built by people. The moment that truly shifted my perspective wasn't loud. It happened during a board prep session. We were reviewing the annual revenue summary deck. I noticed something immediately. The attribution slide grouped all closed revenue under sales performance. No breakdown, no departmental contribution, no operational strategy credit, just one clean number under one team. I asked gently, "Should we clarify cross-functional contributions, especially for partnership-driven revenue?" There was a pause. The CFO responded, "At that level, the board cares about outcomes, not mechanics." Mechanics. That's what my work had become in their vocabulary. Necessary, technical, replaceable. I nodded. I didn't argue. But something inside me settled differently that day. I realized I had been normalizing small dismissals because none of them were catastrophic on their own, but added together. They told a story about how I was seen and, more importantly, how I allowed myself to be seen. Reliable, supportive, background. And the more quietly I absorbed it, the more permanent it became. That was the moment I stopped waiting for perception to correct itself. Not outwardly, but internally, something recalibrated. I was still doing the work. I was just no longer assuming anyone else was keeping track. I was, carefully. There's a moment in every long-term professional relationship where you realize the role you've been cast in, not the one in your job description, the one in people's minds. For me, that realization arrived quietly. It was during our annual strategic planning offsite, 2 days at a downtown hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows and catered optimism. Leadership broke into groups to brainstorm vision-level growth initiatives. I was assigned to the operations breakout. Not a revenue strategy, not expansion modeling, operations. By then, I had already structured the pricing experiments that led to our highest margin product tier. I had negotiated back-end revenue sharing agreements with 2 of our largest integration partners. I had re-engineered our renewal process to reduce churn by nearly a third. But in the mental map of the company, I was still infrastructure. I didn't protest the assignment. I walked into the smaller conference room, opened my notebook, and listened as the discussion revolved around workflow automation and CRM hygiene. Important things, just not the things driving 73% of our revenue. At lunch, I passed the main ballroom where the revenue team was presenting Vision 2.0. On the screen was a slide outlining expansion into enterprise partnerships, complete with a timeline that mirrored the roadmap I had drafted 6 months earlier. My language was there, my framework was there, my name was not, and what struck me most wasn't anger. It was clarity. They didn't see me as the architect. They saw me as the engineer, the one who executes once the direction is decided, the one who makes ambitious ideas functional, reliable, useful, invisible. Roles harden over time. Once people assign you one, they filter everything you do through it. If you challenge it, they feel friction not because you're wrong, but because you're deviating from the script they've grown comfortable with. After the offsite, the CEO sent a company-wide message praising the revenue leadership team for their bold strategic thinking. Operations was thanked for ensuring stability. Stability? I reread that email 3 times. There's nothing wrong with stability. Companies need it. But stability doesn't usually get equity increases. Stability doesn't get keynote slots at conferences. Stability doesn't get positioned as irreplaceable. Stability is expected. And expectation is dangerous when it's invisible. That week, I had a one-on-one with my direct manager. During the conversation, he said something that, at the time, sounded benign. Harper, you're invaluable because you don't need recognition. You just get it done. I smiled politely, but inside, something clicked. I had been promoted into a role defined not by impact, but by emotional labor. The calm one, the low-drama one, the self-sufficient one, the one who wouldn't demand recalibration of perception. And because I never corrected it, the company built its comfort around that version of me. That's when I understood something important. They weren't malicious. They were efficient. People rarely reevaluate roles that are working for them. So if I wanted anything to change, it wouldn't come from confrontation. It wouldn't come from louder meetings or sharper emails. It would come from information, not presented emotionally, presented undeniably. I closed my laptop that night and took my leather portfolio out again. I began reorganizing my records, not just by project, but by measurable revenue impact. If they saw me as stability, that was fine. But I knew the numbers told a different story, and numbers don't argue. They reveal the shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation or after a sharp comment. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening, long after most of the office had left. The building always sounded different after 6:30 p.m. The air conditioning softened. Conversations disappeared. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass walls of the conference rooms. I was alone at my desk, reviewing quarterly attribution data. There's a kind of honesty in data when no one else is watching. No performance, no positioning, just rows and columns telling the truth without interpretation. I ran a full-year report instead of the usual quarter. Then I filtered by deal influence, then by the strategy origin, then by a restructuring initiative. And for the first time, I layered everything together. The number that appeared at the bottom of the spreadsheet made me sit back. 73%. 73% of closed revenue over the past fiscal year had direct documentation linking back to my initiative's pricing architecture, territory reallocation, partnership modeling, churn prevention, and restructuring. Not assist-level contribution, primary strategic origin. I stared at it for a long time, not with pride, with stillness, because numbers like that don't make you feel triumphant when you've been invisible. They make you feel clear. For years, I had suspected my impact was larger than the narrative suggested, but suspicion leaves room for self-doubt. You tell yourself you might be overestimating, that maybe leadership sees something you don't. But this wasn't an interpretation. This was documented revenue. I printed the full breakdown, 47 pages, clean, time-stamped, annotated. Each initiative is cross-referenced with CRM entries, board decks, and email threads. I didn't slam the printer tray. I didn't feel anger rise in my chest. Instead, something inside me relaxed. I realized I had been operating from a subtle place of insecurity, hoping my value would be recognized organically, hoping someone would eventually connect the dots. But recognition is a function of visibility, and visibility is a function of positioning. I had been doing the first without securing the second. That evening, I packed the printed report into my leather portfolio and shut down my computer. On the elevator ride down, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. If they truly understood this number, would they still see me the same way? And a more difficult one followed. If they didn't understand it was that my responsibility to fix, when I stepped into the parking garage, the air felt cooler than usual. The city noise echoed faintly between concrete pillars. I paused beside my car and looked back at the building. I had given it 5 years, built systems that would outlast me, carried pressure that wasn't always mine, and for the first time, I considered something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. What if my silence wasn't humility? What if it were permission? Not permission for others to disrespect me intentionally. Permission for them to remain unaware. That night, I didn't make any dramatic decisions. I didn't draft resignation letters or schedule confrontations. I simply went home, placed the portfolio on my desk, and opened a new folder on my laptop labeled Attribution Archive. Not as a threat, as preparation, because something had shifted inside me. I was no longer hoping to be seen. I was preparing to be undeniable. After that night, my silence felt different. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit formed from years of being the easy one, the one who didn't interrupt, didn't challenge publicly, didn't complicate dynamics. Now, it was deliberate. There's a subtle power in choosing not to correct someone immediately, in allowing them to fully inhabit the version of reality they've constructed, especially when you have documentation that says otherwise. In meetings, I stopped volunteering clarifications unless they directly affected revenue risk. I answered questions precisely, but I no longer expanded beyond what was asked. I let assumptions stand when they weren't dangerous. Not out of spite, out of observation. It was fascinating to watch how quickly people interpret quiet consistency as passive agreement. If I didn't object, they assumed alignment. If I didn't reassert authorship, they assumed shared ownership or no ownership at all. Mark grew more confident presenting revenue projections that were built on models I had constructed. The CFO continued summarizing quarterly gains as strong sales execution. My manager praised my maturity in staying focused on operations. Maturity, another flattering word that often means compliant, but internally, I was tracking everything. Every board slide that referenced initiatives I designed, every public acknowledgement that omitted the strategic origin, every meeting where attribution was blurred. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I was building clarity. At the same time, I became more precise with my communication. Follow-up emails became structured and time-stamped. Strategy proposals included version histories. Shared documents listed contributors explicitly, not defensively, simply factually. And something interesting happened. No one pushed back, because clarity, when delivered calmly, is hard to argue with. Silence also created space. When you stop over-explaining, people fill the gaps with their own assumptions. Leadership began discussing expansion plans without looping me in early. They assumed I would operationalize whatever direction they chose, which meant they were making strategic decisions without understanding the architecture beneath them. I noted where projections were overly optimistic, where partnership agreements lacked sustainable margins, where churn risk was quietly increasing because of aggressive pricing experiments. Previously, I would have stepped in early, smoothing the edges before friction formed. Now, I let minor inefficiencies surface, not catastrophic ones, not anything that would damage clients or violate my standards, but enough for patterns to become visible. Silence, when strategic, reveals capability gaps. And the more I stepped back from anticipatory problem solving, the more noticeable those gaps became. I wasn't sabotaging, I was withdrawing invisible labor. That distinction mattered to me. There's a difference between harming a system and allowing it to function without hidden support. Meanwhile, I continued refining my attribution archive. I categorized revenue by strategic origin, documented board acknowledgments, and created a clean executive summary just in case it was ever needed. I didn't know yet when or how I would use it, but I knew something else with certainty. If the narrative about my performance ever shifted, if the role they assigned me turned from reliable to replaceable, I would not argue emotionally. I would present numbers, because silence isn't weakness. It's often reconnaissance, and I was done being surprised by how I was perceived. If there was going to be a turning point, I wanted to meet it prepared. Preparation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like routine. From the outside, nothing about me changed in those months. I arrived at 8:15 a.m. I carried my leather portfolio. I attended meetings. I responded to Slack messages within a reasonable time. I hit every operational deadline. If anything, I appeared even steadier. What they never noticed was how methodical I became behind the scenes. First, I audited the CRM history going back 3 years, not to inflate my impact, but to correct inconsistencies. Attribution fields had been filled casually in earlier stages of growth. Some initiatives were tagged under departments rather than individuals. I cross-referenced timestamps with archived email threads, board decks, and version histories of strategy documents. When I found gaps, I didn't edit records recklessly. I added notes, attached source files, cleaned up language, made everything defensible. If someone ever questioned it, I wanted to be able to say, calmly, here's the documentation. Second, I mapped revenue influence hierarchically, not just direct closes, but strategic origin. There's a difference between the person who presents a proposal and the person who designed the pricing structure that made the proposal viable. A difference between the rep who signs the contract and the analyst who identified the partnership channel in the first place. I built a visual model simple, executive-friendly, showing revenue streams branching from initial strategic decisions. When I overlaid annual numbers, the pattern was unmistakable. 73% traced back to frameworks I had either created or materially restructured. I didn't exaggerate the number. If anything, I excluded gray areas to keep it conservative. Third, I studied our employment contracts and bonus structures. Quietly, I reviewed my original offer letter, my promotion amendments, the equity vesting schedule, the language around performance expectations. There was a clause that stood out: termination for performance-related deficiencies required documented performance improvement plans unless immediate misconduct occurred. I hadn't received any performance warnings. No PIP, no formal corrective notice, just consistent reviews labeling me strong and dependable. I saved that detail in a folder labeled employment terms, not because I expected conflict, because I no longer believed in being unprepared. Meanwhile, subtle changes began emerging in the company's internal dynamics. The sales team pushed aggressively into enterprise deals without fully modeling long-term service costs. Margins tightened. Customer success began flagging a strain in implementation capacity. Previously, I would have preemptively redesigned the onboarding flow to absorb the impact. This time, I drafted recommendations clear, concise, and sent them upward. When they weren't prioritized, I didn't chase. I let the friction surface, not to prove a point, but to allow reality to become measurable. The CEO started asking sharper questions in leadership meetings. Why are enterprise margins thinner than forecasted? Why is churn slightly elevated in mid-market? There were explanations, external factors, market shifts. I listened, and I kept documenting. At home, my routine grew quieter too. Instead of venting to friends about work frustrations, I spent evenings refining my executive summary, a 12-page document that distilled 5 years of contribution into 3 clear sections: strategic origin, revenue impact, documented attribution. No adjectives, no emotion, just numbers, timelines, and cross-references. I printed one hard copy and kept it in my portfolio. The rest lived encrypted on my personal drive. What they never noticed was that I stopped needing validation, not because I felt superior, but because I felt informed. When you know exactly what you've contributed, you stop negotiating with doubt. You stop asking whether you imagined your value. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's narrative. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was preparing for any version of the future, and preparation creates a certain calm. It's hard to intimidate someone who has already audited the truth. The private reveal didn't happen in a conference room. It happened on a Monday morning at 7:40 when I arrived early enough that the office still felt neutral before personalities filled it. I opened my laptop and pulled up the full fiscal year dashboard. Not filtered, not segmented, just total revenue, broken down by source, partnership channel, pricing tier, and strategic origin. Then I overlaid one more layer: compensation, not just mine, but departmental bonus pools tied to performance metrics. I wasn't looking for injustice. I was looking for alignment. What I found was clarity. The revenue streams most heavily influenced by my strategic modeling, the enterprise partnerships, the pricing restructures, the retention optimization framework were directly fueling the highest executive-level bonuses. The board-facing narrative attributed those gains primarily to sales acceleration. Operational strategy wasn't mentioned in compensation summaries. And again, this wasn't about ego, it was about leverage. Because leverage isn't just about what you've done, it's about who benefits from what you've done. I exported the compensation-linked revenue streams and compared them to my own salary progression over the past 5 years. Steady increases. Respectable bonuses, but disproportionate to the scale of impact. 73% of annual revenue traced back to frameworks I built, yet my role remained categorized as support infrastructure. That was the moment the reveal solidified. Not emotionally, structurally. If the company truly believed I was underperforming, the numbers would collapse without my strategic input. If they believed I was replaceable, the transition would be seamless. But the documentation suggested something different. They didn't fully understand the architecture holding their revenue together. And because they didn't understand it, they underestimated its source. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unexpected. Not resentment, not vindication, just stillness. For years I had wondered whether I was exaggerating my importance, whether my perspective was skewed by proximity to the data. But the compensation overlay removed ambiguity. My impact wasn't just internal, it was financially central. And yet, I was not positioned as central. That distinction mattered. Around 9:15 p.m., the office filled. Conversations started. Coffee machines hummed. Mark walked past my desk, energetic as usual, talking about a new enterprise prospect. I watched him briefly and realized something important. He wasn't malicious. He genuinely believed he was driving growth. From his vantage point, closing deals, presenting to clients, speaking to the board, the missing piece wasn't intention. It was visibility into the origin, and visibility into origin was something I controlled. That morning, I drafted a concise executive revenue attribution report. 10 pages. No narrative framing, no commentary. Just revenue by strategic initiative, initiative originator, timeline of implementation, financial impact per quarter, documentation references. At the top of the document, I wrote a simple header. Fiscal Year Revenue Attribution Summary, prepared by Harper Whitmore. Not defensively. Factually, I saved the file as a PDF. Then I did something small but significant. I scheduled an automated monthly export of strategic attribution data to my personal secure archive within legal and contractual boundaries. Nothing proprietary was removed unlawfully, just records of my authored work and documented contributions. Not because I anticipated conflict, because clarity deserves continuity. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It didn't change how I behaved that week, but it changed how I understood power. Power isn't volume. Power isn't position. Power is knowing exactly where the structural weight sits and whether you are the one carrying it. By the time I closed my laptop that evening, I wasn't wondering whether I mattered anymore. I knew, and knowing shifts posture, even if no one else can see it yet. The decision point didn't come with a warning. It arrived in the form of a calendar invite titled Performance Alignment Discussion. 30 minutes, Conference Room 4B, my manager and HR. I remember looking at the subject line and feeling unsurprised. Not anxious, not defensive, just aware. Over the previous quarter, enterprise margins had tightened more than projected. Customer success had flagged onboarding strain. Forecast accuracy had dipped slightly because aggressive sales assumptions weren't fully grounded in operational capacity. I had documented recommendations. Some had been implemented. Some had been deprioritized. The system was showing small fractures. And when fractures appear, organizations look for explanations. Sometimes they look in the wrong direction. When I walked into 4B, the room felt rehearsed. My manager's tone was measured. HR had a printed document in front of her. The phrasing was careful. Concerns about strategic leadership visibility. Feedback about limited executive presence. Questions about cross-functional initiative ownership. And then the sentence that landed with clinical precision: we're evaluating whether your performance aligns with the evolving needs of the organization. I listened without interrupting. They weren't accusing me of misconduct. They weren't referencing missed deadlines or errors. The critiques centered around perception, leadership presence, proactive communication, and executive influence. In other words, narrative, not numbers. As they spoke, I realized something important. I had 3 options. First, I could defend myself emotionally, remind them of every initiative I had led, argue for recognition, demand acknowledgement in the room. Second, I could overcorrect, promise to be louder, more visible, more assertive in meetings, adapt to the role they now expect. Third, I could allow the narrative to complete itself and respond with information at the precise moment it mattered most. The first option would feel reactive. The second would feel performative. The third would be irreversible, because once data is introduced formally, it can't be unseen. They concluded the meeting by outlining a short-term evaluation period. No formal PIP yet, but language that implied dissatisfaction. I nodded. I understand, I said calmly, and I meant it. I understood that perception had calcified. I understood that my silence had contributed to it. I understood that organizations sometimes rewrite contribution history when convenient. But I also understood something they didn't. If they moved toward termination for performance-related reasons, they would need documentation. And documentation was something I had in abundance. That evening, I sat at my dining table with my leather portfolio open in front of me. The revenue attribution summary rested on top. I thought about my moral code. Never exaggerate, never lie. Let facts speak before feelings. If I escalated preemptively, if I sent the full report to the board without provocation, it would feel strategic, but premature. If I waited, I risked losing timing control, but timing is power. And so I chose the third option. I would not interrupt the narrative. I would allow them to formalize their assessment, and if they decided my performance was inadequate, I would respond in the only language that mattered in that building. Revenue, once submitted, it would change the equation completely, and there would be no quiet way to reverse it. After the performance alignment discussion, nothing outwardly changed. That was the unsettling part. No formal warning, no written PIP, just subtle shifts in tone. Fewer invitations to early-stage strategy calls. More summaries were delivered to me after decisions had already been made. It was as if I had been gently moved from architect to observer. I didn't resist it. Instead, I began moving in silence. First, I scheduled a consultation with an employment attorney, not because I intended to sue, not because I wanted conflict, because clarity is calmer than assumption. I brought my offer letter, promotion amendments, recent performance reviews, and the documentation outlining their verbal concerns. I also brought a condensed version of my revenue attribution summary. The attorney reviewed everything carefully. "Have you received any written performance warnings?" she asked. "No." "Any documented performance improvement plan?" "No." She nodded slowly. "If they terminate you for performance without documented corrective steps, especially given your reviews, that's complicated for them." "Complicated?" I didn't smile. I simply asked, "If that happens, what's the cleanest way to respond?" Her answer was straightforward, remain factual. Submit documentation, avoid emotional escalation, protect my professional reputation, which aligned perfectly with my moral code. Second, I updated my LinkedIn quietly, not with dramatic announcements, just refined language reflecting strategic leadership and revenue architecture. I reached out to 2 former colleagues at other firms' exploratory conversations. Nothing committed. Options create stability. Third, I finalized the executive revenue attribution report. I added a cover email draft unsent addressed to the CEO, CFO, and board distribution list. The subject line was neutral: fiscal year revenue attribution clarification. The body was brief. No accusations, no defensiveness, just a statement that, in light of recent performance discussions, I believed a data-backed review of strategic contribution would be helpful for alignment. Attachment revenue attribution summary, Harper Whitmore. I saved it in drafts. Then I waited. Weeks passed. Tension in leadership meetings grew subtly. Enterprise margins continued to compress. A high-profile mid-market client signaled dissatisfaction with onboarding delays directly tied to capacity concerns I had previously flagged. Still, no formal documentation was sent to me, until one Thursday morning, another calendar invite. This one is titled Follow-Up Performance Outcome. 30 minutes. HR is present again. When I walked into the room, the energy felt resolved. They had made a decision. The phrasing was measured, sympathetic. After reviewing leadership alignment needs, we believe this role requires a different executive presence. We're moving forward with separation due to performance concerns. There it was. Not misconduct. Performance. I listened fully before responding. They outlined severance terms, 2 weeks' pay, standard NDA, health coverage transition details. I asked one question: Can you confirm in writing that this separation is performance-related and not misconduct? HR nodded, yes. I thanked them for the opportunity. I kept my tone even. I did not argue. They seemed almost relieved that I wasn't reacting emotionally. That was the final confirmation I needed, because once performance becomes the official reason, numbers become relevant. When I left the building that afternoon, carrying my leather portfolio, I felt surprisingly steady, not because I had won anything, but because the moment I had prepared for had arrived, and I was ready to respond precisely, calmly, irreversibly. I didn't send the report immediately. Timing matters more than reaction. When I stepped into the parking garage, the late afternoon light filtered through concrete slats in long gray stripes. My access badge had already been deactivated. My laptop had been left upstairs. The box HR offered me sat untouched on the passenger seat. I had very little to carry out. 5 years reduced to a quiet exit. I sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. Instead, I opened my personal laptop. I connected to my hotspot, logged into my personal email, attached the finalized PDF revenue attribution summary, Harper Whitmore. I reread the cover message one last time. It was 8 sentences long. It acknowledged the performance-based separation. It expressed appreciation for the opportunity. It stated that, for clarity and alignment, I was submitting a documented summary of fiscal year revenue attribution tied to my authored initiatives. No adjectives, no accusations, just data. I addressed it to the CEO, the CFO, and the board distribution list included in prior investor updates contacts I had access to through archived communications, not internal systems. I checked the attachment twice. Then I pressed send. 4:42 p.m. There's a peculiar calm that comes after a decision you've prepared for thoroughly. No adrenaline spike, no shaking hands, just finality. I placed my laptop back in my bag. Before I could put the car in reverse, my phone rang. It was the CEO. 4:47 p.m. 5 minutes. I let it ring once more before answering. Harper, he said, and his tone was different from what it had been upstairs. Less managerial, more unsettled. Can you come back inside for a moment? I glanced at the building entrance. My badge has been deactivated, I replied evenly. A brief pause. Right. Of course. We can meet in the lobby. I stepped out of the car. When I walked back through the glass doors, the receptionist looked confused. I gave her a small nod. Within 2 minutes, the CEO and CFO appeared near the elevators. They had both clearly read at least the executive summary. The CFO spoke first. These numbers. Are you stating that 73% of last fiscal year's revenue traces directly to initiatives you originated? I'm stating, I replied calmly, that 73% of closed revenue has documented strategic origin or material restructuring attributed to frameworks I authored. All documentation references are included. There was no defensiveness in my voice, just precision. The CEO exhaled slowly. We weren't aware the percentage was that high. I understand. I said, and I did, because visibility had never been centralized around origin, only around execution. The CFO asked, why didn't this come up earlier? It wasn't previously relevant to a performance discussion. I answered. Silence followed. Not hostile, just recalibrating. In that lobby, no one raised their voice. No one apologized dramatically. No one accused anyone else. But something had shifted. The narrative that had justified my termination lack of strategic impact now conflicted directly with documented financial contribution. And data, once presented at that level, creates consequence. Within the next 24 hours, leadership would need to answer internal questions. Board members would notice discrepancies between public attribution and documented origin. Compensation narratives would be re-examined. None of that required me to argue. It only required me to present the truth. Standing there, I realized something quietly powerful. I hadn't forced a confrontation. I had introduced alignment. And alignment, when it exposes imbalance, always triggers movement. The CEO looked at me carefully. Harper, he said, slower this time. We may need to reconsider, but reconsideration doesn't erase decisions already made, and the consequences had already begun. We moved to a small seating area near the lobby windows. No conference room, no formal setting, just 3 chairs and a glass table that suddenly felt far more significant than the boardroom upstairs. The CEO had my report open on his tablet. The CFO scrolled through a printed copy someone had rushed downstairs. They weren't defensive. They were calculating. I want to understand something clearly. The CEO began. If this attribution is accurate, and it appears to be thoroughly documented, why has this never been framed this way in executive reviews? It was available in the systems. I said, it just wasn't centralized. That was the truth. No one had hidden the data. It simply hadn't been synthesized at the executive narrative level. The CFO leaned forward. Harper, this fundamentally changes the context of a performance-based termination. I nodded once. I understand. What I didn't say was, that's why I waited. If I had introduced the numbers during a routine strategy meeting, they would have been absorbed as interesting, perhaps even praised. But introduced after a formal performance dismissal, they forced a structural contradiction. The CEO ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd never seen from him in meetings. Is there any reason, he asked carefully, that you wouldn't be open to rescinding the separation and revisiting your role? There it was, the reversal. But reversals aren't clean. I looked at him steadily. With respect, I said, the decision was framed as performance-based. That language carries professional implications. Before considering any change, I would need clarity around how that narrative would be formally corrected. Silence, not hostility, just awareness. Because it's one thing to invite someone back quietly. It's another to publicly acknowledge misjudgment. The CFO spoke more softly this time. If we were to issue a revised statement clarifying that this was a strategic realignment rather than a performance deficiency, I didn't interrupt. But I also didn't immediately agree. The truth was, something inside me had already shifted beyond reinstatement. When an organization demonstrates that it can misinterpret or overlook that scale of contribution, it changes the foundation of trust. And trust, once fractured, doesn't restore through urgency. I would need time to consider any revised offer, I said calmly, and any continuation would require a redefined role reflecting documented strategic origin, not operational support. I wasn't negotiating emotionally, I was aligning structure with reality. The CEO nodded slowly. That's fair. In that moment, I could see the ripple effect already forming upstairs. Board members are receiving forwarded emails. Compensation discussions are being re-examined. Leadership credibility is under quiet review, not because I expose them publicly, but because numbers don't bend around narrative once formalized. The irony wasn't lost on me. Had they simply conducted a comprehensive internal attribution review before labeling my performance insufficient, this moment would never have happened. But organizations often move faster than their own data, and speed, without full visibility, creates errors. As we stood to end the conversation, the CEO said something almost reflective. We made a decision without fully understanding the architecture behind our revenue. I held his gaze. Yes, I replied gently. You did? There was no triumph in my tone. Only truth. And sometimes, truth arrives too late to fix the initial decision, even if it's early enough to prevent the next one. They asked me to come upstairs, not to the original conference room, to the executive boardroom. It was almost 6 o'clock p.m. By then, most employees had gone home. The glass walls reflected the fading light of the city skyline, and the long walnut table felt unusually bare. No presentation decks, no catering trays, no quarterly projections. Just 3 people recalibrating reality. The CEO began. Harper, we need to understand how this disconnect happened. There was no accusation in his voice, only concern and something else. Respect. I folded my hands lightly on the table. The disconnect happened gradually. I said, attribution wasn't centralized. Strategic origin wasn't tracked at the executive narrative level. Over time, visibility consolidated around revenue presentation rather than revenue architecture. The CFO nodded slowly. You're saying the systems reflected it, but leadership interpretation didn't? Yes. No edge, no emphasis, just clarity. Mark was called in briefly, not confrontationally, but to review certain partnership timelines referenced in the report. When he walked in and saw the document open on the screen, his expression shifted from confusion to realization. I didn't know it was structured like this, he said quietly, scrolling through the initiative timelines. I knew you built the pricing framework. I didn't realize how much tied back to it. I know, I replied, and I did. This wasn't about villainy. It was about assumptions filling empty space. When there's no explicit ownership narrative, People default to proximity. The person closest to the client appears central. The architect behind the scenes becomes infrastructure. The CEO leaned back in his chair. The termination was premature. The sentence hung in the air. Premature, not malicious, not careless, but incorrect. We can correct it. He continued. We can rescind the separation formally and restructure your role to reflect strategic leadership. We'll need to address the board, of course, but we can fix this. Fix. I considered the word carefully. You can correct the documentation, I said evenly. You can clarify the narrative. But the decision itself revealed something structural. No one interrupted. When performance is evaluated primarily through visibility rather than documented impact, I continued, it creates risk, not just for me, for the organization. The CFO exhaled softly. That's fair. Again, no heat, no raised voices, no emotional speeches. Just professionals confronting an oversight that had quietly escalated into consequence. The CEO looked at me differently now. Not as stable, not as support, but as structural weight. What do you want, Harper? He asked finally. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. And for the first time in 5 years, the role wasn't assigned to me. It was open. I paused before answering, not for effect, but for honesty. I want alignment, I said, between contribution and recognition, between strategy and attribution. And if I continue here, I want it formally defined. Silence followed, but it was no longer dismissive. It was listening, and that's the difference between being invisible and being undeniable. I didn't give them my answer that night, not because I wanted leverage, because I wanted clarity. When I walked out of the building for the second time that evening, the city felt different from the way it had an hour earlier. Not triumphant, not cinematic, just quieter. For 5 years, I had operated inside a structure that benefited from my steadiness without fully understanding its weight. That realization wasn't bitter, it was instructive. Over the next few days, the CEO sent a formal email to the board clarifying that my separation had been initiated under incomplete performance analysis and was under review pending structural reassessment of revenue attribution. HR, revised documentation. The performance deficiency language was paused. They moved quickly. Organizations do so when financial exposure becomes visible. They offered a revised role, Vice President of Revenue Architecture, direct board visibility, formal attribution tracking embedded into executive reporting, compensation aligned with revenue impact, including retroactive bonus adjustment tied to documented contribution. It was, objectively, everything I had once hoped would happen organically, but something inside me had already evolved. Recognition secured through confrontation feels different than recognition granted through foresight. It's not less, but it changes the texture of trust. I took a weekend alone, no dramatic retreat. Just time without noise. I reread my own documentation, not the numbers, the notes I had written in the margins months earlier. Silence is permission. Documentation creates clarity. Don't confuse reliability with invisibility. Those weren't accusations. They were lessons. I realized something important. My growth in this story wasn't about reclaiming a title. It was about reclaiming authorship, not just of revenue, but of identity. For years, I had allowed others to narrate my role because it felt easier than correcting them. I told myself that humility meant staying small, but humility and self-erasure are not the same. In the end, I made a decision that surprised even me. I declined the reinstated role. Not angrily, not dramatically. I thanked them for the revised offer. I acknowledged the correction. I affirmed my respect for the organization's willingness to recalibrate. And then I chose to leave. Because once you understand your leverage fully, you no longer need to prove it inside a structure that once overlooked it. Within 2 months, I joined a growth stage firm as chief revenue strategist with attribution architecture embedded into the company from day one. Not because of revenge, not because of headlines, because I knew exactly what I was capable of building. And this time, I built it in the open. I'm still calm, still analytical, still not the loudest person in the room, but I no longer mistake silence for virtue. I choose when to speak. I choose when to document. And I never again allow my contribution to exist without structural acknowledgement. That's who I am now. Not louder, just aligned. When people hear this story summarized, they focus on the dramatic line. They fired me for poor performance, and the CEO called me back before I even left the parking lot. It sounds cinematic, but the truth is quieter than that. I wasn't saved by a last-minute miracle. I wasn't vindicated by emotion or confrontation. I wasn't secretly plotting revenge. I was prepared. That's the part that matters. For years, I believed that consistent excellence would naturally translate into accurate perception. I believed that if I worked hard enough, documented thoroughly enough, and stayed humble enough, the narrative would eventually correct itself. Sometimes it does. Often, it doesn't. Organizations move fast. People rely on visibility. And when contribution lives behind systems instead of in spotlights, it can be misread. The lesson I learned wasn't prove them wrong. It was this: never let your value exist only in other people's interpretation. Document it. Understand it. Be able to articulate it calmly, precisely, without anger. Because when the moment comes, whether it's a promotion conversation, a performance review, or an unexpected termination emotion, will always be questioned. Data rarely is. Quiet dominance isn't about silence. It's about choosing when silence serves you and when clarity is required. When I pressed send on that revenue report, I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was aligning the narrative with fact. And alignment, even when uncomfortable, is a form of respect for yourself and for the truth. If you're watching this and you feel invisible in a room where you carry weight, I won't tell you to be louder. I'll tell you to be prepared. Know what you've built, know what depends on you, know what changes if you're not there, and then decide strategically how you want to be seen. So I'm curious, have you ever realized your value only after someone underestimated it? Tell me in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.